By the winter of year 1889, the mining camps of the Tobacco Root Mountains were no longer working against time. They were running from it. Every axe strike sounded like a countdown. Every spark from flint felt like a prayer. 23 men had staked claims along Alder Creek, cabins rising in the thin, unforgiving light of shortening days. By wall, they braced for the moment the mountains stopped tolerating guests. These were not greenhorns. They'd seen horses freeze mid-step. They'd heard rivers turn to ice that sang in the night. Jim Morrison trusted in woodpiles and tight chinking. Pete Sanderson built like the Norwegians taught. Thick walls, centered hearth, steep shake roof. Charlie Webb swore geometry beat luck, so long as the walls were square. They believed they knew winter's rules. Then the rules changed. On November 8th, a lone rider appeared on the trail from the high pass. The horse moved slow, wary, already paying winter's debt. The rider's coat was thin, his pack was nearly empty, his tools were wrong. No saw, no axe. Only a digging stick tipped with iron, Blackfoot made, though the men didn't know it. Heads lifted from half-built cabins. Morrison paused, mallet resting on his shoulder like a judge, preparing a sentence. "Too late for building," he muttered. "Ground'll take him before December." The verdict spread as fast and cold as frost. One look was all the camp needed. He wouldn't survive the first storm. The stranger didn't defend himself. He didn't speak. He studied the valley the way a tracker reads a trail, why the wind bent the grass, where snow refused to settle, where warmth still clung to the earth. His eyes found a single towering spruce, roots gripped deep like the mountain's own fingers. He touched the bark, once as if greeting an old teacher. "What's he doing?" Webb scoffed. "Talking to trees," Morrison said. "That's a man who's done." Nervous laughter crackled in the cold air. The stranger, Jack Thornton, didn't flinch. He set down his pack, drove the iron tip into the frozen duff, and began cutting a square into the earth. Slow, precise, not frantic work, chosen work. The valley watched with the morbid curiosity reserved for disasters about to unfold. Sanderson guessed he was digging a root cellar. Webb said grave. Both felt possible. As dusk bled into the snow, Morrison called out, "Any fool can dig his own hole. Only you'd call it shelter." Thornton looked up, eyes calm, voice steady. "This tree's stood 3 centuries. It's learned something worth listening to." Then he returned to digging. The words unsettled the men more than they cared to admit, because each of them, behind their rules, their wood, their pride, had felt winter's teeth. And winter didn't care about blueprints. The camp clung to habit. Thornton trusted the ground. Days passed. Axes rang, saws rasped, smoke rose. But beneath it all came the steady whisper of iron cutting soil. Men stole glances toward the spruce. Thornton worked by lamplight, shaping his pit with the certainty of a man following instructions no one else could see. At night, a faint glow pulsed from below, firelight breathing through roots. No one went close. The first killing frost hit on the 12th. The creek glazed white. Laughter died in throats, cabins sealed, roofs reinforced. Fear settled in. Thornton dug deeper. Steam curled from the soil when he pierced the frost line. Whispers spread. Luck, some said. Madness, others claimed. The truth was simpler. Below a certain depth, the earth forgets winter. Each evening the men passed his claim and saw not a fool, but a man half buried in the world, yet somehow ahead of it. The cold around him didn't attack. It worked with him. By the time the first snow dusted Alder Creek, Thornton's pit had become something else. Walls packed tight by centuries-old roots, a sloped entry to trap the cold low. River stones lining a small firebed, ready to hold heat through the night. Not a hole, not a gamble, an equation. Earth plus heat plus patience equals life. The others didn't see that yet. They saw a man in a ditch with no roof, but just before the first storm, the wind shifted. It carried snow, and something harder to ignore: possibility. For the first time, Morrison felt doubt crawl under his certainty. He stared at the faint lamplight beneath the spruce and thought, if he's wrong, he dies. If he's right, everything I know about survival is a lie. The snow had not yet fallen, but the test had begun. One man with a shovel against an empire of wood and habit. Morning broke hard and brittle across Alder Creek, the light thin as scraped tin. Frost clung to the valley floor in white armor, creaking beneath the boots of men who believed they understood survival. While they set to reinforcing walls and splitting logs, Jack Thornton carved a rectangle in the earth beside the giant spruce. He began without ceremony. No grand announcement, no explanation, just a man with a digging stick, cutting through the duff like a surgeon following familiar anatomy. The stick was more than a tool. It was an inheritance of knowledge, traded from a Blackfoot craftsman who had shaped it for winter ground. Its iron tip broke frozen soil with surprising grace, prying apart layers of earth that had rested undisturbed for centuries. By noon, Thornton had cleared the soft, rich duff, hundreds of seasons of fallen needles compressed into insulating humus. Beneath it lay sandy loam, dry and yielding, with no sign of the damp that would rot a cabin from the inside. He nodded once to himself. The soil was exactly as he'd been taught to search for, a natural cradle of warmth, drainage, and shelter. Across the creek, Morrison leaned on his cabin wall and called out, "Day 2 of building your own coffin, friend." His tone was half jest, half warning. Sanderson smirked, but kept working. Webb, farther downstream, cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Even badgers pick higher ground." But some of the laughter didn't land as firmly as yesterday, because the man in the dirt didn't look desperate. He looked precise. Thornton's excavation grew to 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and nearly 4 feet deep, dimensions chosen not from guesswork, but memory. He measured space not for comfort, but efficiency, small enough to heat fast, large enough to live without suffocating. He paused occasionally to trace root lines with his fingertips, mapping their direction. The spruce's roots curled around the perimeter like the ribs of a ship's hull, nature's own framework. He carved shallow niches between them, knowing each recess would later cradle supplies, clothing, firewood, and tools. He was not fighting the earth. He was shaping his shelter into it. As the sun dipped low, the valley's curiosity sharpened. Men found excuses to walk the perimeter of their claims simply to glimpse the progress. They expected chaos, disorder, the frantic work of a man racing death. What they saw was deliberate craft, each step executed as though rehearsed 100 times. That night, as the miners retired to their half-formed cabins, Thornton lit a small fire near his excavation, placed stones around it to warm, then buried them beneath the spruce's roots where they would slowly release heat into the earth. It was a trick learned on a Dakota plain, where a lodge stayed warm through storms that froze the world outside solid. On the morning of November 9th, frost silvered the grass like glass powder. Thornton resumed his work, without greeting or glance toward the cabins. He deepened the pit, shaping the floor with a slight slope toward the entry point for airflow management. Another lesson from people who had survived winters without wasting a scrap of effort. Morrison sipped steaming coffee, voice loud enough for others to hear. Digging deeper just makes the grave tighter. But this time, his gaze lingered longer than his confidence. By midday, Thornton reached a depth where the air felt distinctly different. Beneath the frost line, the soil's breath held a subtle warmth, 45 degrees on the coldest morning. He removed a glove, pressed his bare hand to the soil, and smiled. The land beneath was alive with stored heat. That moment marked a quiet shift. Webb, passing with an armload of cedar shakes, slowed. He stood for a long beat before muttering, "Feels warm down there?" Thornton didn't look up. "The ground remembers summer longer than we do," he said. "You just have to reach where memory hasn't frozen." The simplicity of the truth unsettled something in Webb, though he pretended otherwise. 3 more days passed. The excavation completed, Thornton turned his attention to the roof. 4 lodgepole pines, cut thin, stripped clean, were laid across the pit's width as the main support beams. He placed them with the instinct of a man following a blueprint engraved in mind, not on paper. Their spacing was exact, chosen to bear the weight of snow that mountain winds would pack like stone. Morrison paused mid-strike of his hammer, watching the alignment. It was the first moment he didn't look amused. He looked thoughtful. Then came the bracing saplings, dozens of straight young spruce limbs laid across the beams at right angles, each one tested for strength, each one positioned like ribs across a spine, distributing weight so no single point bore the winter alone. Next, a layer of spruce boughs, needles angled downward to shed meltwater, followed by overlapping sheets of bark peeled from deadfall trees. Not a single living tree was harmed in that process, and that quiet respect for the land was something no miner had ever considered a factor in survival. The result wasn't a roof in the European sense. It was a layered breathing barrier shaped by wind, water, and snow itself, designed to welcome winter's weight, not resist it. As dusk colored the sky violet, Sanderson walked to the edge of Thornton's claim and leaned against a stump. "You truly think this'll keep you breathing come December?" he asked, not mocking now, but searching. Thornton looked up, sweat beading cold on his brow. "Cabins fight winter," he said softly. "I intend to let winter do the work." And in the faint light, for the first time, someone in Alder Creek wondered if the fool might not be a fool after all. But winter was nearly at their heels, and the storm waiting beyond the horizon would expose the truth faster than any argument. The first snowstorm arrived not as a whispering warning, but as an ambush. On the night of November 16th, the Tobacco Root Mountains inhaled, then exhaled winter, with a violence that stole breath from the living. Dawn had shown a pale sky, deceptively calm, but by afternoon, clouds the color of iron had gathered over the ridges like a war council. By nightfall, the valley was under siege. A wind from the northwest tore through Alder Creek with the force of a battering ram. Snow didn't fall. It attacked sideways, whipped into needles by 40-mile-an-hour gusts. Temperatures plummeted nearly 50 degrees in less than a day, crashing from a tolerable 23 to a bone-splintering 24 below zero before midnight. Inside his cabin, Jim Morrison fed his fireplace, as though trying to bribe it into mercy. Flames leapt desperately, yet the cold seeped faster than the fire could chase it away. The mud and grass chinking he had packed with pride just days earlier shrank and cracked under the brutal temperature drop, splitting into thin black fissures that widened with every hour. Icy air sliced through the gaps, chilling the interior until breath crystallized in lantern light. He jammed more wood into the flames. It flared, roared, then powdered, unable to claim victory over the invading cold. Across the creek, Charlie Webb faced disaster even quicker. His cabin, newly built and never tested by true Arctic fury, revealed its fatal flaw. The chinking failed like wet paper under a hammer. Snow blew through the walls, as if the structure were a loosely woven basket. Webb stuffed rags into cracks, hammered boards over gaps, and still the wind screamed through. By the second night, his water bucket had frozen solid. His boots stiffened near the hearth. His fingertips burned with that peculiar pain that doesn't warn. It announces the beginning of frostbite. Meanwhile, Pete Sanderson, whose cabin was considered the camp's best built, fought a quieter, more insidious battle. His walls held, but the space inside was too large to heat. Warm air fled to the high ceiling, while the floor, where a man's bones met the night, stayed. Cold enough to numb his feet through wool socks and boots. Every 2 hours, Sanderson woke to feed the fire, not for comfort, but for survival. 3 cabins, 3 forms of failure. Outside, the storm snarled for 8 merciless days, but 40 feet away, hidden beneath the snow-laden boughs of the spruce, Jack Thornton slept. No rattling shutters, no howling wind clawing through seams, no midnight woodcutting with half-frozen hands. His tree pit shelter held at 48 to 50 degrees through the worst of it. He woke to warmth. He slept through the night. His fire consumed barely a fraction of the wood, the others burned before sunrise. Inside his earthen chamber, the walls hummed with stored warmth, the slow exhale of the earth itself. Snow piling above acted not as a threat, but a quilt, thickening the insulation. The low ceiling trapped heat where a man's lungs drew breath. Cold air slid into the entrance trench and stayed there, obedient to the laws of physics older than language. Thornton sharpened tools, mended gloves, oiled his boots, and even wrote by firelight, activities unthinkable beyond his insulated sanctuary. But the freezing men did not yet know the full measure of his success. Their pride, though cracking, held fast a while longer. On the 5th night of the storm, Sanderson heard a knock at his door. Weak, frantic, Webb stood there, face ghost pale, lips blue, eyes wide with fear that stripped the arrogance from him. "Pete, I can't stay in there. It's colder inside than out. I'll die in mine." Sanderson pulled him in, but the cost was immediate. 2 men meant twice the breath, twice the heat lost to the roof, twice the need for fuel. Within 12 hours, Webb and Sanderson burned through nearly a week's worth of wood. By the 7th night, Morrison's cabin glowed with firelight like a beacon of stubbornness. But inside, he sat hunched, shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in days. His beard glistened with frost. Ice crystals feathered across his wall, shimmering like mockery of the warmth he sought. He swallowed the last sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and whispered into the shadows, "That fool is warm. Has to be." The storm began to break on the morning of the 24th. A grim stillness settled. No wind, no snow, just a collapse of weather that felt less like peace and more like the mountains pausing to judge who remained. When Webb stepped outside Sanderson's cabin, he saw a soft plume of smoke rising from beneath the snowdrift at the base of the great spruce. Not frantic, not struggling, a calm, measured column of warmth. Webb stared, breath hanging in the quiet air. The man they mocked hadn't gambled. He had known. But the blizzard wasn't the end of the lesson. It was only the test that revealed who had prepared for winter and who had merely built walls. When the storm finally loosened its grip, Alder Creek resembled the aftermath of a siege. Snowbanks leaned against cabin walls like white tombstones, and paths carved by desperate boots told stories of cold that nearly claimed the living. The first miner to approach the spruce that morning was Sanderson. His face was gaunt, eyes bloodshot from nights without rest. He paused at the mound of snow, concealing Thornton's shelter, and called down into the narrow entrance. "Jack? You alive in there?" Silence hung a moment. Then a voice drifted up. Calm, steady, almost rested. "Come on down. Bring your fingers close to the fire before they go numb for good." Sanderson hesitated only seconds before crawling feet first into the angled tunnel. The cold air pooled in the trench as expected. He slid past it and emerged into a space washed with amber glow. Inside, it was warm. Not just survivable, comfortable. The kind of warmth that made shoulders loosen and lungs release the breath they'd been holding too long. Thornton sat cross-legged on a raised platform carved into the root mass, feeding a small fire the size of a dinner plate. A metal pot simmered quietly beside him. The walls around them radiated gentle heat, like sun-warmed stone, long after sunset. Sanderson stared, unable to reconcile the evidence. How? His voice cracked. How is this possible? Thornton gestured for him to sit and handed him a cup of hot broth. The earth doesn't freeze where the sun still sleeps, he said. Below the frost line, she keeps 45 degrees. All I did was borrow 5 more. He explained, not boastfully, but like someone honoring the people who taught him. The living wood of the spruce held warmth better than dead logs. Snow on top acted as insulation, not a threat. The angled entry trapped cold air. The small interior demanded little fuel. Everything in here works with winter, he said, not against it. Later that day, curiosity overcame pride. When Morrison crawled into the shelter, he expected smoke-thick air or cramped misery. Instead, the warmth wrapped around him like a coat he'd forgotten the feel of. Thornton handed him a seat near the fire. Morrison stared into the embers a long while before speaking. I burned near half my winter wood in a week, he confessed. Walls leaked cold, like holes in a boat. Felt like I was drowning in ice. Thornton didn't gloat. He simply stirred the embers. Cabins are built to store people, he said softly, not warmth. Morrison swallowed hard. Shame wasn't new to him, but this kind, born of stubbornness exposed, was a different cut. As words spread, miners gathered by the spruce, eager not for mockery this time, but understanding. Thornton stepped outside to show them the proof. He pressed his hand to the snow-covered roof, and steam rose from where warmth met ice. Snow is a blanket, he explained. Dry snow holds more heat than timber walls. The land teaches if we listen. He walked them through the principles. The living spruce absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. Beneath the frost line, the soil held steady warmth even in the coldest months. Cold air fell into the entrance trench while warm air stayed where men breathed. A fire no larger than a hat brim heated the chamber for hours. The miners listened in humbled silence. Every swing of their axes, every log they split, every fire that nearly burned their shelters down had been a war against nature they never needed to fight. Thornton paused, eyes on the tree line. The people who taught me didn't fear the cold, he said. They learned from it. If stories like this remind you that wisdom often hides in places we overlook, you're not alone. There are lessons from the past that still have the power to change how we live today. As evening fell, the spruce shelter glowed beneath the settling dusk. Webb approached last, reluctant, hands buried deep in threadbare gloves. He stopped in the entrance, unable to crawl inside. Not yet. Pride still held his spine rigid. Thornton met his eyes. You're welcome, he said gently, whether you come in or not. That single sentence carved deeper than any cold wind. More storms were coming, colder, longer, crueler. And soon the men of Alder Creek would face a choice: cling to the walls they built, or humble themselves to learn from the earth beneath their feet. Morning broke brittle and blue. The storm had moved on, leaving the camp in a silence that felt like judgment. Breath plumed from every mouth. Boots snapped the crust of snow with a sound like breaking glass. No one laughed now. No one teased the man beneath the spruce. Jim Morrison stood at the entrance to Thornton's shelter with his hat in both hands, like a penitent at a church door. He had always been the sort of man whose voice made decisions sound like laws. Now he spoke to the snow. Jack, he said, I need help. The words seemed to surprise even him. He waited, head bowed, as if the mountains themselves had demanded tribute for the admission. After a heartbeat, Thornton's voice drifted up from the tunnel. Come in out of the killing air. Morrison slid down the angled passage, boots brushing frost, shoulders grazing the packed walls. The cold pooled at the bottom like a basin of night. but beyond it the chamber breathed a gentle warmth. He emerged into the orange glow where Thornton tended his careful fire. Half the men in the valley would have fed that flame until it roared. Thornton never let it grow larger than necessity. Morrison removed his gloves with trembling care. Purple crept across his fingertips, frostbite's first handwriting. He flexed, winced, and swallowed the pain. Thornton handed him a steaming cup. The broth wasn't much, but it tasted like a reprieve. "I cut all week," Morrison said hoarsely. "Ate smoke more than food. Slept in pieces. Doesn't matter how much I burn. Heat flees upward and the cold crawls in through the seams." Thornton nodded. "Walls store people," he repeated gently. "Not warmth." Morrison stared into the little fire, eyes reflecting both flame and shame. "I mocked you," he said. "Called you a fool. You called me what winter calls anyone who tries something it doesn't recognize," Thornton answered. "You were speaking the language of fear, I know it well." They sat without speech for a time, listening to the soft sigh of air moving in the entrance trench, the cold settling where it could do the least harm. When Morrison finally looked up, there was something childlike in the set of his mouth. "Teach me," he said. Thornton glanced toward the low ceiling, as if the roots themselves might pass judgment. "We can build one beside the creek bend," he said. "Shallow roots, good drainage, south light. We'll start with a test pit." Morrison exhaled like a man who'd been holding bad air for years. Word of that conversation moved through the valley faster than the wind that had frozen it. By afternoon, Pete Sanderson, face hollowed by weeks of broken sleep, stood at the spruce with Webb beside him. Webb tried on a smirk and found it didn't fit anymore. "Jack," Sanderson said, "if you can spare the time." "Two hands will dig faster than one," Thornton said. It became a procession. Men who had mocked stepped down into the warm chamber and felt the truth melt around their bones. Comfort without waste, heat without panic, design without arrogance. Thornton set a pot to simmer, showed calloused palms, and talked them through the shapes the earth wanted. Outside, Alder Creek transformed. Morrison and Thornton marked a rectangle near a younger pine and began to excavate, the older man learning to move his body to the rhythm of the ground rather than the clock. Sanderson measured his own site with the care of a cabinet maker. He sketched lode paths in the snow with a stick, then nodded as roots offered their own blueprint. Webb, too proud to ask, too tired to pretend, hovered at first, then joined with a shovel, cheeks burning from more than the cold. None of them built alone. A strange fellowship formed, men trading the sound of axes for the scrape of earth and the hush of shared breath. They learned new words for old truths: thermal mass, stratification, entrance trap. And they learned older words for science they'd never respected: root, bark, snow. Morrison proved the most stubborn student and the quickest study. Every misstep he owned like a scar. Every improvement he noted with the focus of a soldier relearning how to stand. When his trench angled too steep, he filled and recut. When his saplings bowed under load, he culled the weak and reset the crosspieces. For a man who had once measured success by how much wood he could fell in a day, restraint became his most surprising strength. Webb carried his shame like a sack he refused to drop. He worked until his breath hitched, then worked another hour, as if he could dig his mockery back into the ground and bury it under the roots. At dusk on the third day, Thornton found him staring at the sky. "What are you looking for?" Thornton asked. "A sign I'm not the same fool who laughed," Webb said. "You're not," Thornton replied. "The cold already changed you. Now you get to decide what it shaped." They cut, placed, and layered. Beams across the span, ribs across the beams, boughs across the ribs, bark across the world. They learned to lay needles downward so melt water ran like ink along the correct lines. They packed the entrance trench with a craft that turned physics saw into comfort, low enough to collect the night, high enough to keep feet from living in it. By the week's end, Morrison's shelter held steady at the same earthy warmth, breath misting only near the tunnel, fire small as a prayer. Webb's wasn't beautiful, not yet, but it spared him from the endless night of waking to feed a ravenous flame. Sanderson's, of course, looked like a joiner had argued with the ground until they agreed on symmetry. The valley's noise changed. Instead of axes and curses, a softer industry settled. The scrape of soil, the dull thud of a beam set well, the exhale of men who no longer mistook suffering for virtue. Even the river seemed to run quieter. On a night when stars sharpened to needles in the black, Morrison stepped from his new shelter, looked toward the spruce, and raised a hand. Thornton, standing in the doorway of his own, returned the gesture. Neither man spoke. Some apologies don't need sound. What humbled them was not a man. It was the order beneath their boots, the one they had ignored because it wore no nails and made no smoke. The ground had waited patiently to be consulted. And when it was, but winter was not yet finished. One more lesson waited in the thaw, the kind that wouldn't bite, but would carve itself into memory long after the snow surrendered. The long freeze loosened its grip, as if the mountains unclenched a fist. Snow settled into heavy, grainy drifts, then slowly withered. Edges darkened around stones. Rivulets returned to the creek, murmuring like a town lifting its voice after a funeral. The men of Alder Creek emerged not as survivors, staggering from wreckage, but as apprentices stepping from a classroom, carved into earth. Spring work in that valley had always been a race: repair, resupply, repay the body for the debt of winter. This year, the pace felt different, purposeful, unhurried by panic, measured to the heartbeat of land instead of fear. The shelters had changed more than the temperature. They had altered how a man counted his hours. Morrison proved it first. He knelt at the edge of a test trench, fingers sunk into damp soil, as if reading a book written in a language he had only just learned. "See that?" he said to Webb, who crouched beside him. "Sandy loam, not clay. Feels dry even after melt. That's drainage talking. That's a foundation listening." Webb squinted, skeptical face softening into curiosity. He pinched the soil and let it fall. It crumbled, not clumped. "Never thought dirt could answer questions." "It always did," Morrison replied. "We asked the wrong ones." Pete Sanderson documented everything. His notebooks, once a carpenter's ledger of cuts and joins, filled with diagrams of load paths through saplings, notes on bark lay angles, and sketches of entrance tunnels adjusted for wind direction. He mapped the camp's trees like a surveyor of living architecture: root spread, trunk circumference, age guessed by bark history. He added a new category to his rows of figures: respect. When a thaw-swollen gust rattled the valley, Sanderson's shelters didn't flinch. Snowmelt seeped, but the drainage trenches carried it away like a practiced hand steadying a cup. Where chinking had once slumped and cracked, the living wall, root and soil, breathed and held. Work spread beyond survival. Webb, who had always prided himself on craft with metal, extended his shelter by a short tunnel into a workshop chamber. In that space, still warm, always dry, he cleaned ore screens, honed tools, and mended supplies, without the bite of wind stealing warmth from his fingers. Productivity, he realized, wasn't a matter of stamina. It was a matter of design. Other miners wandered into the valley, drawn by rumor. A winter where men slept full nights, fires that didn't consume forests, shelters that rose from the ground without scarring it. They arrived with the old habits in their packs: axes, brash confidence, the assumption that suffering proved worth, and many of them left with different tools: measuring lines, shallow spades, a willingness to kneel. Thornton did not become a preacher. He became a reference. Men came to him with questions and left with responsibilities. He would walk their claims, pause with palm on bark, and ask the tree as much as the man, "Will you hold them? Will they honor you?" If the answers felt wrong, he said so. If they felt right, he taught the sequence again. Earth, beam, rib, bough, bark, snow, like a hymn. Some evenings he and Morrison stood by the creek, watching the late light turn the water to hammered copper. Morrison had regained weight, color, sleep. He had also lost elements he didn't miss: the need to be right, the pride that called itself leadership while serving only fear. "I thought I knew winters," Morrison said once. "You knew how to endure them," Thornton replied. "There's another way." Morrison smiled, lines around his eyes deepening. "Live with them. Learn from them," Thornton said, but he nodded to the same truth. The valley's soundscape altered permanently. The ceaseless appetite of chimneys no longer defined the nights. The saw's rage quieted to the occasional grateful cut. Wind still spoke in the trees, but it no longer hunted men through cracks and high ceilings. It prowled past and moved on. When hard weather returned in fits, as it always does even in spring, the shelters answered with the same calm logic. Fires stayed small. Sleep stayed full. Work continued. The men who once bragged about how much wood they could burn now compared how little they needed. They found other benefits they hadn't expected. Food stores kept better in the steady cool near the entry trench. Boots dried without cracking. Tools hardly rusted. The earth gave them a climate control they hadn't known to request. And then came the day that sealed the lesson deeper than any lecture. A party of 3 prospectors from the next valley arrived, gaunt and red-eyed, boasting of cabins that would shame the cold and brows that would outstare the mountain. They left their horses tied high in the wind and laughed at the sight of men ducking into warm holes like foxes. "Come back after a long blow," Webb said mildly, surprising himself with gentleness he did not always feel. "We'll see who's standing." A squall rolled in that night, brief, sharp, a reminder. The visitors returned at dawn, faces abraded by ice, and stood at the spruce like men reconsidering old prayers. No one mocked them. Morrison put a shovel in the closest man's hands and pointed to a patch of ground with good fall. Sanderson walked the other 2 through the sequence as if reciting a recipe. Thornton checked the routes and nodded. The camp expanded by 3 shelters, and its pride shrank by 3 old forms. By late spring, the valley looked like a school drawn in earth tones. Low mounds at the bases of trees formed a rhythm through the timber, each one a decision to live by listening. Paths between them wore smooth, shared stacks of carefully cut, small diameter wood rose modestly, as if refusing to announce themselves. Someone hung a strip of white cloth near the creek on a willow branch. When the wind moved, it flickered like a flag for a country with no borders and one law: work with what is true. On a clear afternoon, Thornton walked alone to the original spruce and laid his hand on its bark. He felt, as he always did, the living pulse beneath, slow, patient, unconcerned with weather. He remembered the first day he'd arrived with a single digging stick, and a certainty he could barely defend with words. He remembered the laughter like buckshot, and the quiet that followed when the cold did its arithmetic. He did not think of conquest. He thought of gratitude. Footsteps approached through needles and meltwater. Morrison stood beside him, hands on hips, surveying a valley that no longer measured strength by smoke. "Funny," Morrison said. "What we used to call comfort." Thornton glanced sideways. "We named suffering a skill," he said. "Easier than admitting we'd stopped learning." They let the silence lengthen, unafraid of it. The creek talked. A bird stitched a simple melody above them. The spruce breathed. "Come, look," Morrison said finally. gesturing toward the bend. Webb's adding a second chamber. Says he wants a place for spring work where mud won't take his tools. They walked together, not as teacher and student, not as prophet and convert, but as men who had survived the same winter and decided not to forget it. And just beyond the new growth, another choice waited, the kind that arrives every year in the first true heat. What to keep, what to leave, and which wisdom to carry forward when the world grows soft again. Summer softened the mountains until the memory of winter seemed like a story the land had told in another language. Grass returned first, thin and tentative, then thickened into a green that erased the white scars of snowdrift. Wild flowers pierced the thawed soil, and the creek, once a frozen artery, ran clear and sure, stitching the valley back to life. But the men of Alder Creek did not forget. They walked differently now, not with the braced swagger of those who conquer land, but with the grounded step of those who have learned to live with it. The old cabins still stood in places, weather-beaten and hollow, like monuments to a belief system that no longer held power. No one suggested repairing them. No one needed to. Alder Creek had found a new shape. Visitors who passed through in the warmer months paused, puzzled, at the sight of low mounded doorways at the bases of trees. They expected smoke curling from chimney tops, not warmth breathing from the earth. Some travelers scoffed, at first. Others knelt, felt the shade of the entryways, and understood without asking. Not all wisdom needs a preface. One evening, as shadows stretched long across the forest floor, the men gathered around a small fire beneath the branches of the great spruce, the one that had sheltered the first lesson. No one needed to lead the conversation. It rose on its own, like heat from coals. Sanderson spoke of the ease of sleeping through a storm without waking every 2 hours to feed a fire. Webb spoke of working winter ore in his new underground workshop, how productivity grew, not from grit, but from designing warmth that stayed. Morrison spoke last, eyes reflecting the glow. "I used to think comfort made a man soft," he said. "Thought suffering proved strength. But cold doesn't care how tough you are. It just waits for the moment you grow tired of fighting it." He looked toward the tree roots where the first shelter still rested, unseen beneath the summer green. "Turns out, strength isn't how long you endure the wrong way," he continued. "It's how quickly you're willing to learn a better one." Thornton listened without interrupting, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea. When the others fell quiet, he spoke in that same measured cadence that had unnerved them months ago. But now, it steadied them. "Winter wasn't the teacher," he said. "It only gave the test. The land taught us. The ones who lived here before us learned how to hear it. We almost froze because we thought we didn't need their language." He looked up through the spruce branches at a sky turning lavender with dusk. "The earth remembers what works," he said. "We're just catching up." A breeze moved through the canopy overhead, and a soft rain of needles settled around the men like a benediction. For a long while, no one spoke. The silence didn't strain. It held. When the fire burned low, the men drifted back to their shelters one by one, lanterns bobbing softly among the trees like warm, wandering stars. Thornton lingered after the others left. He placed his hand once more on the spruce, on the rough bark that had held steady through storms that could have eaten them alive. "Thank you," he whispered. It was unclear whether he meant the tree, the land, or the people who had shared their knowledge with him. Perhaps all three. He turned toward his shelter, and as he stepped inside, his lantern glow disappeared into the earth, not swallowed, but welcomed. The valley slept in quiet harmony that night, not out of fear of the cold, but in gratitude for warmth earned through humility. If this story stirs something in you, a reminder that old wisdom still has a place in the world, stay with us. There are more forgotten lessons worth hearing, and more voices from the past still offering guidance if we're willing to listen. Subscribe, share this with someone who believes learning never ends. And may the winds of thought carry these stories to those who need them.